Friday the 1st of May 1998. In the village of Charlestown, County Mayo, 83-year-old Eddie Fitzmaurice closes up shop. Following a routine he has kept for years, he relaxes in front of the TV before peacefully turning in upstairs. But the quiet sanctity of Eddie's home is about to be shattered in an attack which will eventually result in his torturous and prolonged death. Those born in the early 1900s in rural Ireland would see in their lifetimes a huge influx of modern commerce and industry, which would change the world in which they lived completely. One who would bear witness to these momentous changes was Eddie Fitzmaurice.
He was born in 1915, June 1915. He come from a place called Ballyhonus in County Mayo. He came to Charlestown with a brother of his called Patrick, and they opened a butcher business in Church Street in Charlestown. My father met my mother in the early 40s, and they got married in September 1943. They set up business of drapery and footwear, and they ran it between them. My mother usually ran the shop, and Dad spent a lot of time, as well as running the shop, on the farm as well.
Somewhere between running a successful small farm and the drapery business, Eddie and Rita found time to rear 2 sons and 2 daughters.
He was a man of the world at the time, and he didn't show a lot of affection, but he was there for us at all times. We never wanted for anything, I must say that. And then at 18, I emigrated over to England, as did my brothers and sisters as well.
In the absence of their children, Eddie and Rita focused fully on the drapery and footwear business, becoming a well-known and well-respected couple in the area.
They were always together, like. You never saw Eddie out on his own. You always saw the wife with them. They look very nice woman too, like, you know. But they were a very close couple, very, very close couple. In business and in social life as well, like, you know.
They seemed to be a couple that achieved what they set out to do and did it very well.
However, in 1990, their 47-year-long relationship was brought to a sudden end by Rita's unexpected death.
Eddie coped with the situation very well. He dressed very well, he looked after himself very well, and he coped with the situation maybe a lot better than other people would cope with it, but he was a tough individual, like, you know. He stuck with the job he had, he stuck with the shop he had, and he was still a great member of the community in every shape and form, like.
Whether he mentally missed or not, he didn't show it physically, you know. He didn't get emotionally, break into emotions or anything about it, you know. He seemed to just grab it and carry it on.
Showing grit typical of his generation, Eddie threw himself into the drapery business, channeling his energy into his one and only passion in life.
His hobby was his business. He loved that shop. He spent hours in that shop every day. He had a routine. He'd go up to the pub about 1 to 2 o'clock in the afternoon, have his few pints. He'd come down and reopen the shop, and that shop would be open till 7 o'clock in the evening, maybe 8 o'clock. He'd have the local farmers in who didn't like the supermarkets, who didn't like going shopping. They'd come in, they'd buy their Wellington boots, their socks, and they could have a discussion. There'll always be a barter about the price of the products. If he said it was £5 for a pair of Wellingtons, they'll turn around and say, we'll give you £4. And so they'd eventually come to an agreement for the price, and that's the way it was.
See you later.
See you. Bye.
He was one of those familiar faces, but also I think there was a respect for him that he was still working, that he was active, he was fit. He was fit of body, he was also fit of mind as well. And he, as the people locally would describe him, as this very young 82-year-old. You wouldn't guess what age he was. You wouldn't guess he was a month short of his 83rd birthday. He just had a vibrancy about him that people warmed to.
He always was a healthy, strong man, right up until the day he died.
Eddie's movements on the day that he was last seen alive were normal movements. He had opened the shop earlier that day, he opened it again that evening, and the last two people who were able to tell Gardaí that they saw Eddie Fitzmaurice were two women who went in together that evening, and they bought some pillowcases and they had a good chat with Eddie. They were only in the shop for around 10 minutes or so. They bid him good night at around 8:20. They were the last customers that Friday night, and Eddie then locked up the shop. It's then likely that he would have watched television, perhaps the Late Late Show on that Friday night.
As Eddie relaxed that evening, he unknowingly became one of a growing number of elderly people falling victim to a spate of similar, though unconnected, robberies directed at vulnerable members of rural communities around the country.
A man named Paud Skeen was in a coma in Limerick Regional Hospital. He had been targeted in his home in County Clare by a gang from Limerick who had tied him up, hung him upside down from banisters and tortured him as part of a robbery at his home where he lived alone. 2 years before that in Galway, a man was targeted and attacked and tortured and ultimately left for dead in Galway. Also in 2000, where two brothers from Dublin, members of the travelling community and criminals, travelled to County Meath, where they targeted two elderly men, elderly brothers, Peter and Paddy Logan. And during that attack, Paddy Logan suffered a heart attack and he died. But none of these crimes are linked in the sense that you have different criminal gangs doing the same type of thing.
Despite this worrying trend, those close to Eddie maintain that he was unconcerned for his own personal safety.
All the times I visited him while I was there, he never gave me any indication that he felt insecure, that he felt any fear, that he felt that there was anybody going to infiltrate his privacy.
I think Eddie was pinpointed. It wasn't personal in the sense that it wasn't anybody with a grudge against Eddie Fitzmaurice, but he was specifically targeted because they believed he had cash on his premises and they believed they could get in, attack him and get out. The way the killers got into the house was through this window which they forced open with an implement at the back of the house. They could have simply, if they were looking for cash downstairs, have ransacked the shop, and they did search around the shop, but they went upstairs.
Some of them confronted Eddie in his bedroom. We don't know whether all the people who participated in the burglary were present in the bedroom, but the house was very well searched, and we are satisfied that a sum of money was stolen from the house that night.
Eddie was a fit man. Although he was 82 years old, if there was only one attacker, he might have been able to defend himself in some way, fight back, or do something to raise the alarm.
My father would have tried to defend himself and his property. Right up, I'd say. He took more of a chance than he should have done, but that's the way he was.
Eddie had injuries which would show perhaps he had received a few blows to his head, which would all indicate perhaps efforts to subdue him, added to being tied up and being gagged as well. These weren't just loose bindings that eventually Eddie was going to escape from. They were tied in a way that he was never going to be able to free himself.
Having taken whatever money they found in Eddie's home and shop, the attackers fled the scene, most likely in a vehicle.
The people involved in the break into Eddie's house that night could have parked a van or a car at the rear of Eddie's house, and this would not have been seen by people who would have been driving or walking on the main street in Charlestown.
Where Eddie Fitzmaurice lived and worked was on the north end of Charlestown. So basically he's on the Sligo end of the town. So did the attackers figure that they could come in the Sligo direction, target Eddie and get back out that road? It's just a theory.
Whichever way the attackers fled, Eddie was left alone in his upstairs bedroom, bruised, bound and desperately in need of help. But with no one aware of his plight, Eddie's ordeal was far from over. The morning of Saturday, May 2nd, dawned brightly in Charlestown. People busied themselves with their plans for the bank holiday weekend, but in the Fitzmaurice house, nothing stirred. Eddie Fitzmaurice had not kept to his strict routine, and his shop remained closed. It may have been assumed that Eddie had taken a holiday, perhaps visiting relatives who lived nearby.
Dad never took a holiday in his lifetime. So why should they have thought he'd have taken a holiday that particular weekend? So I think they were a bit naive, not investigating why they hadn't seen him around the town, because he was up that town every day, 7 days a week. The shop was always open. Why didn't they investigate? I don't know.
The simple answer to that question is nobody ever thought something like that would happen in Charlestown. That's the simple answer to the question. Nobody ever thought that.
It was 5 days before anyone investigated Eddie's disappearance. On Wednesday, the 6th of May, a concerned neighbour, having not seen the shop open or any sign of Eddie himself in the preceding days, decided to check the premises.
He saw that there was a front window open, and he went around the back and he saw that there was a window that was open.
Hello? He called out for Eddie and got no reply. He climbed in through the window and went looking for Eddie, all the time calling his name.
He then saw there was a light on in the landing upstairs, and he was beginning to see that things looked out of place in the house. He went upstairs, and in the front bedroom of the home, he found the body of Eddie Fitzmaurice. He saw that Eddie was lying on his back. His hands were tied behind his back, his ankles were bound, and Eddie Fitzmaurice died in distress.
He immediately called the Gardaí, and the Gardaí came to the scene. The scene was immediately preserved, and a full murder investigation then commenced.
We have in excess of 40 detectives working full-time on it. We have our own divisional investigation team, we have the Technical Bureau, and we have the National Bureau of Criminal Investigation, and we have a very committed and dedicated team, and we are determined to solve this crime. We regard it as a particularly callous and cruel crime to leave an elderly man tied and gagged in his home and left there to die. That is particularly cruel.
As a result of the initial investigation, Gardaí were able to piece together what had taken place in Eddie's home after he was attacked.
He suffered over days before he died, after the attackers had fled, and he was still alive, but helpless. He was shuffling as best he could, inch by inch, using his buttocks, his knees, his elbows, whatever he could,
He tried to get out of the binds that he was in, and there was a ligature which had been around his mouth. It had been slightly removed when he was found.
He would have taken a superhuman effort to try and get towards the front of the house, the front bedroom, where the window was open, to try and shout out for help. But even having got there, he still didn't have the strength to call out to such a degree that people might hear him.
Cold, bruised and exhausted, Eddie's moans and pleas were too weak to reach the ears of anyone who could help. However, the Gardaí investigation uncovered one witness who had heard suspicious sounds coming from Eddie's home on that Saturday.
She was thumbing a lift across the road from Eddie's premises, and she heard these muffled sounds, and she called to a number of local houses because she was concerned by what she heard, trying to figure out what it was, but she got no reply. Gardaí believed that was most likely Eddie calling out for help, but it was an impossible task. Eddie's attackers left him in a position whereby he did not stand a chance.
The cause of death was established as hypothermia due to his inability to protect himself from the elements.
He froze to death, and perhaps not all of the attackers intended that he was going to die, but a simple phone call, an anonymous call to anybody, would have raised the alarm, would have saved Eddie Fitzmaurice's life.
That's all they had to do, a phone call away. But they didn't carry out that, so that's only a conclusion I can get to them people. They were, to me, scumbags.
Eddie Fitzmaurice was a good, clean-living, law-abiding, God-fearing man who went about his own business and was highly thought of in the town. The way he had been left to die, tied up, gagged, frozen, had a huge impact on the community.
What happened there will never leave the community, I don't think, in Charlestown. Like what happened was he was a very sound type of individual. Eddie was. That such a thing could happen to such a man. It had an awful effect, and will have an effect, I think, in this town for years to come. Never be forgotten about the way the man died, you know.
This was a slow, lingering, horrible death that Eddie suffered, and he did his best to raise the alarm and to save himself. He fought, but ultimately it wasn't enough. And that stays with everybody, even if you never met Eddie Fitzmaurice. To think of what happened to that man, it leaves people speechless.
Not only the manner of Eddie's death, but also the circumstances surrounding it resonated with communities all around the country, raising questions over whether or not the elderly should be allowed to live as independently as Eddie had. Locally, there was even some criticism aimed at Eddie's own family.
We had made our lives years ago in another country, and we just couldn't up roots and go over there to help him out. And he seemed, at that time, to not want any help. He seemed to be coping well with his widowed life, you know. So there was some people in the community that pointed fingers at us at that time.
He was a very, very independent man, and he would not have gone into a home, and there's nothing you can do with people have the rights, and if you know, why cannot an old person live on their own where they've lived all their lives without this fear?
And fear was the overriding emotion for the community, who now looked to Gardaí based at